thanks for coming along to our function today, and thanks for King and Wood Mellison for providing this facility today. It's great to have Bill Shorten back at the Sydney Institute. He's been a long-time friend of the Sydney Institute, and we're always pleased when he can spare his valuable time to come and talk to us. He's well known to all of you, graduate in law arts with an MBA, member for Maribyrnong since 2007, minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments, leader of the Labor Party between 2013 and 2019, and as I recall, the only opposition leader to lose two close elections so narrowly. No one else has done it. He's the toughest political leader, the most unlucky political leader in Australian history, according to my knowledge of it all. And of course, currently Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Government Services. And today, the Minister's going to talk to us on the NDIS at 10. Bill Shorten, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Gerard, and the members of the Sydney Institute, both here and virtually, for the invitation to talk tonight about the NDIS at 10 years. I first of all start by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person who's present. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't support the concept of a national disability insurance scheme in Australia. Because to say that if you don't support the concept of a national disability insurance scheme, it's akin to saying you don't think that people with permanent and severe functional disabilities have the right to live an ordinary life. That is all that the NDI seeks to do, to help empower and give agency to people enjoy an ordinary life. Just as the services and the equipment, which has been funded by the NDIS, allow people a dignified existence, some independence, the ability to work or be with friends, it allows the choice to live independently. The Australian community deserves some commendation for the existence of the NDIS. It's their generosity which supports it. So they, quite rightly, have high expectations of the stewardship of the scheme. And they have no tolerance for a system which was designed to enable, not delivering on that promise to the actual participants. What I'd like to do is revisit not just the path to the NDIS at 10, but perhaps the history of social security in the modern society. My very clever colleague, Dr. Daniel Molino MP, has written a very thoughtful book called The Safety Net, The Future of Welfare in Australia. In the book, Daniel takes a look back at Bismarckian Germany in the 1880s, where Bismarck made that country the first to adopt the old age social insurance program, including disability support. I understand that Otto von Bismarck called it practical Christianity, albeit in German. Some might say that was one of the first examples of wedge politics because he was trying to banish the socialists to political obscurity by cutting their lunch. Few would have thought of Bismarck as a woke lefty, certainly not the Chancellor himself. But he did manage at that point in time to out-socialist the socialists. Some 50 years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, himself paralysed from the waist down and wheelchair bound, ran for the US presidency with the title of his policies, The New Deal for the Forgotten Man. An important part of that early 1930s platform was a major federal initiative to help Americans with physical and mental disabilities. Then in 1956, after two Democratic presidents progressed the policy, it was Republican Dwight Eisenhower, with overwhelming bipartisan support, who signed legislation to include disability support in the US Social Security Act. So big reform is not the sole domain of either side of politics. We know that with reference to our own Australian history. Ben Chifley with the Snowy Hydro Authority and the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. It was Robert Menzies who oversaw mass migration from war-torn Europe. Gough Whitlam opened the door to China and instituted free tertiary education. Malcolm Fraser welcomed the Vietnamese boat people. Bob Hawke introduced the Sex Discrimination Act and resurrected Whitlam's idea of universal health care in the form of Medicare. was John Howard, of course, who after Port Arthur oversaw gun reform and introduced the GST. But there's another thing that the Howard government did, which was a milestone in our nation's disability history. At the time that he was Prime Minister, Australian disability rights advocates were instrumental in negotiations on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Australia would actually become one of the first of the member nations to sign the treaty in 2007, and it was ratified then by the Rudd government in 2008. Article 19 of the United Nations Convention states that signatories, and I quote, recognise the equal rights of all persons with disability to live in the community with choices equal to others, and shall take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate full employment by persons with disabilities of this right and their full inclusion and participation in the community. That's what Australia signed up to, and that's what Labor pledged to support in the 2007 election campaign. And of course, led by my colleague Amanda Rishworth, we continue to negotiate a national disability strategy with states and territories to explore, amongst other issues, how to fund and finance and deliver disability services in the future. Australia at that time, in 2007 and 2008, had in place the Commonwealth State Territory Disability Agreement. But people with disabilities complained with a lack of consistency in the application of the agreement, not only between states, but within states and territories. Former Queensland Anti-Discrimination Commissioner Kevin Cox can tell you all about it. He acquired his disability 41 years ago in a football accident. He described life for a person with disability in Queensland in the pre-NDIS era as the misery lottery. If you got funding, you were lucky. Everyone else lived in misery. Without family support, Kevin's sliding door alternative, as he describes it, would have been an aged care nursing home, where his life expectancy would have only been 15 years due to poor quality of care. Anyway, at the famous or infamous 2020 summit in April of 2008, disability advocates Professor Bruce Bonahady and Helena Sykes raised the prospect in the group that I was in that the cost of caring for people with disabilities represents a very large unfunded liability, which would continue to grow significantly. I can remember rather cheekily insisting at the end of the session to write the words on a butcher's paper in this forum, the words social insurance scheme for the disabled. The idea that Australia needed a way for people with disability and their families to be in control of their care, to be able to plan their lives with certainty, to be consumers, not charity. I recall in 2008, as a newly minted Assistant Minister, I set up a disability investment group of Australian business leaders to look at where we could find the money for people with disability. It actually undertook the initial feasibility study back in 2008 of an NDIS. This was followed by the decision of the Rudd government to institute a Productivity Commission inquiry into new approaches for funding and a possible framework. The report was published in 2011. I want to read you a quote. Most people know little about Australia's current disability system, and they do not know how poorly they would be served if they were to need it. This is a system marked by invisible deprivation and lost opportunities. Yet major disability can happen to anyone and at any time. Most families and individuals cannot adequately prepare for the large costs of lifetime care and support. The way that disability used to be funded was by crisis. The more crisis you're in, the more likely you would receive some funding. But that is a very poor way to allocate scarce resources. I remember after the report, Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced that the government would start to work immediately with states and territories on measures that would lay the foundation for a national disability insurance scheme. All jurisdictions agreed. The unanimous backing by the states and territories was a great motivation for me personally and for my colleagues, the then Prime Minister and the Minister then for Disability Reform, Jenny Macklin. It motivated us as we worked together to develop a truly national disability insurance scheme. This was necessary in the same way a national system of income support was necessary, the same way that Medicare and the pharmaceutical benefit scheme was necessary to give equal access to all for medical care and to medications. They are safety nets to catch any one of us should we fall. We needed a national safety net, a national system for Australians with significant and permanent disability not covered by existing insurance schemes for transport and workplace accidents, such as workers' compensation or the Transport Accident Commission that we have in Victoria. We insure our house, our health, and many of us have life insurance through our superannuation. The NDIS is the government's policy to protect people who are born, develop or acquire a significant and permanent disability. We have superannuation and aged care policies underpinned by the same universalist values. One look at the 2021 Intergenerational Report, you can see the wisdom of forward planning in these areas. The report says that our ageing population, caused by increasing life expectancies and falling fertility rates, is Australia's greatest demographic challenge. As the population ages, there'll be fewer people of working age, or put another way, taxpayers, relative to the number of older Australians. Doesn't it make sense to prepare for retirement or have structures in place for those who are no longer to live in their own home? And of course it does. The NDIS does this for the cohort of the Australian population who are severely and permanently impaired. So I put to you tonight at the 10-year anniversary, the NDIS is fundamental. It's universal and it's important. I think it's consistent with the role of government to not only look after our most vulnerable citizens, but its fundamental role as risk managers. As Paul Keating said, the essence of leadership is essentially taking the responsibility of trying to interpret the future to the present. Our job as a government is to look ahead, to paint a picture for Australians and tell them how we will prepare for the big challenges up ahead. You know, a nation's economy needs time to plan if it's to avoid the inevitable policy icebergs, or in the case of disability policy, to avoid that very large unfunded liability, as Bruce Bonahady and Helena Sykes warned us about 15 years ago. Government needs to have vision as a non-negotiable tenet of its approach to policy. Now, just like nation-changing reform isn't the sole domain of one side of politics or the other, neither is having a vision about what you want to achieve for the country. But I will say that the NDIS has been riven by absentee landlord management in the last few years. There has been drift in the scheme, in both its cost base and the manner in which it approaches its decisions. Our election promise last May was to get the scheme back on track to being true to its original objective. Now, I don't dismiss at all any of the financial pressures on the NDIS, but they shouldn't be overblown to become the only issue that we discuss. There are certainly financial challenges ahead, but on my assessment, they're manageable. This seemed to be something which I think the previous government just found a little too difficult. Some issues which were too hard to manage, and the whole scheme, I feel, fell into a sort of Bermuda Triangle of disappeared policy. But the NDIS is bigger and better than its problems. We understand what's driving its growth. There have been higher than projected average payments and participant numbers, unmet demand. Plan budgets are not acting as a true cost control, with many of the increases occurring between reviews, and the current incentives for service providers to increase the volume of support rather than reward outcomes. A large share of the NDIS cost or price is actually labour services. That breaks down to 74%, which is support workers, 12%, which is the payment to allied health workers. Interestingly, only 3.1% of the scheme's costs relate to assistive technology and capital. Now, there are more people entering the NDIS, but many of them have lower complex needs and indeed start with smaller budgets. Of the scheme's 570,000 approximate participants, almost 280,000 are children under 18, which make up nearly 50% of the total number of participants. There are also lower rates of people leaving the scheme than was initially expected by the Productivity Commission. The assumption had also been that many children entering the scheme would follow a burst of early intervention. Early investment must be effective, not just from an economic perspective, but so the children entering the scheme can get good outcomes and assisting in the preparation for their education. The same is true for people who acquire disabilities as adults. Early investment improves the lives of participants and their families, but it has benefits for the broader community. Not only improves participation, productivity and quality of life, but reduces further future costs to government in related areas such as health, social security, housing, carer costs, where carers are unable to participate in the economy. What we have seen, though, as a cost driver is that states have retreated from the field, I think in particular with services for children, leaving the NDIS to be the only lifeboat in the ocean for some. This is not what the scheme envisaged. I'm working right now to strengthen relations with states and territories by increasing engagement from quarterly to monthly meetings with all the jurisdictions' disability ministers. The NDIS in itself can't be the total safety net, and we need to make sure that what is called Tier 2, or additional services for people never envisaged to be in the scheme, are also present in society's offerings. If the NDIA redirects participants to state and territory and other mainstream supports where they're more important, then I think the NDIS will not be left picking up the tab for some of people's schooling, health and aged care system costs. The NDIS, simply put, cannot be the only lifeboat in the ocean. So I think the main impetus, though, for reform is to return the NDIS to its initial vision. And if we do that, we'll have an effective and sustainable scheme which will support generations to come. Our approach is a moderation of the growth curve, not, I think, the more ineffectual, brutal, one-size-fits-all cost-cutting that our predecessors experimented with to no great success and to great harm for the individuals. So I think crucial to our aim of a reform agenda is to restore trust in the scheme and trust in the government, that we don't seek to merely take away what people have. We start with the knowledge that an effective investment reduces avoidable costs. We've already started to crack down on the fraud and the compliance, with better oversight to improve payments and invoicing systems. And it wouldn't be no surprise to members or followers of the Sydney Institute that where there is a large amount of government money being paid to people, other people will engage in opportunistic behaviour to siphon some of that government money before it gets to the people for whom it was designed. Now, we've already cracked down on fraud and compliance, but I want to be very, very clear. It's not the participant who's defrauding the scheme. If we would have a discussion about how we improve the sustainability of the scheme, it cannot start by saying that a particular person doesn't deserve their wheelchair or their home modification or the very crucial allied health therapy which they need. It starts with recognising that you need to monitor the payments. You need to make sure there's not over-servicing, overcharging and under-delivery. The culprits, in my opinion, are external players in this scheme, some of whom have links to organised crime. Just as the gangs from the long day care and other forms in the private vet rorts have seen the NDIS and tried to move into this area too, to, I think, put greater pressure on the scheme and take from both the taxpayer and, even more importantly, the person with a disability. I think it is hard for policymakers to come to terms with the fact that there are people who would opportunistically target a scheme, but they exist and therefore they must be dealt with. That's why we've established a fraud fusion task force not long after coming to government. I used to say when we were in opposition that the government was making it harder to enter the scheme, but they had the back door open. I was wrong. There's no back wall on this scheme. There's no back door. It's all laid out like a box of Tim Tams on the table for some of the opportunistic behaviour. When invoices can be simply submitted without the participant seeing what the service provider's putting in, and without the invoice being interrogated by the payment authority, we deserve better. This lack of scrutiny has certainly been taken advantage of. Government agencies were not talking to each other. This was seen, and this weakness, unfortunately, has seen opportunistic behaviour occur. But we now have agencies and departments, and this shouldn't be as revolutionary as it sounds, but trust me, it is over the last few years. Our Quality and Safeguards Commission, the Insurance Agency, the Federal Police, Service Australia, the Tax Office, now sharing a lot more information with each other. Since May of last year, some 12 operations targeting groups and individuals suspected of fraud have resulted in charges being laid, prison sentences for some offenders, and the seizure of millions of dollars of assets. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Safeguards Commission established evidence the two Victorian entities had falsified and made inappropriate claimants for payment. This has resulted in these two entities being permanently banned from operating in the NDIS and removed their ability to rip off the scheme and people with disability. And of course, this anyone considering ripping off the scheme has had fair warning now that the Fraud Fusion Task Force means business. Having people stuck in hospitals when medically fit for discharge was another example of avoidable costs, just as there's the crime and the overcharging. This is people who are eligible for the NDIS, who are in hospital, and when they're medically fit for discharge, still stay in hospital. Not because they want to, but because there's no plan to where to move them to. It's terrible for the participant. It's a shocking cost for the state hospital systems. It blocks up beds. There are no winners in this system. Before the May election, the Victorian government analysed the average waiting time of NDIS medically fit for discharge people, the amount of time it took from fit for discharge to have a plan worked out and accommodation be found to be 160 nights. Multiply this across 1,500 people across Australia. 160 nights at $2,500, $3,000 per bed per person. Now, unfortunately, we've taken some measures and now we've reduced the average waiting time to 33 days. Now, there are some people for whom they've got challenging behaviours. It's not easy. And what we have done is identify that there's still problems in the system finding adequate housing. But some of the bureaucracy, some of the positively hollow men processes are now being removed. And we've also provided the hospital wranglers with the ability to make decisions rather than ever being referred up to somewhere else in the system. So we think these are avoidable costs in the system. In the question and answer, I'll tell you some others if you really push me and you'll shake your head. Now, there are green shoots of improvement in the scheme, even at an early stage. First of all, we've put people with lived experience of disability in the leadership roles. I appointed Kurt Fernley, Australian Paralympic legend and disability advocate, as chair of the NDIA board. We now have as directors the highest proportion ever of people with disability on the board of the insurance scheme. We've also refreshed the executive team of the NDIA with a new organisational structure and Rebecca Falkingham at the helm as the new CEO. Our comprehensive NDIS review, which was scheduled for this year, we brought forward to last year, co-chaired by Professor Bonahady and respected former Commonwealth Public Servant Lisa Paul, supported by a range of experts. They will deliver their findings no later than October and provide some of their recommendations a lot earlier. Since I've announced the review in October of last year, panellists have been involved in ongoing engagement with states and territories, essential agencies, co-design with people with disability, their families, a lot of people. Now, to date, the review has consulted more than 1,400 Australians, but this level of engagement is essential. If you're to engage in wholesale reform of a scheme, you've got to bring people with you. They need to see where they fit in and they need to feel listened to. The solutions to improving the scheme are there, I have no doubt. We don't start with a blank sheet of paper. But for whatever reason, institutional or ideological myopia, the solutions never seem to make it to action. The level of engagement is crucial, and we've also started tackling some of the other dysfunction in the system. One of the challenges of the NDIA or the NDIS is that a lot of people were forced to go to court, to the AAT, to sort out their claims. You know, the Sydney Institute's studied all forms of politics and isms, capitalism, communism. But the NDIA seemed to have invented a new form of economic allocation called AATism. No decision could be made until the AAT decided how it should be allocated. This is not the way to design a system. So the legacy cases which existed in the scheme at the time of the election, there were 4,500 matters. 2,500 have been dealt with. We've introduced new methods of dispute resolution. I don't pretend that every matter will always be agreed. And sometimes you're just going to have the argument. But certainly the amount of litigation was obscene and destructive and stressful of people. We've also got an outcomes framework, because when we talk about the NDIS, the conversation tends to be purely in terms of price. But we don't look at we haven't been measuring outcomes. The latest participant and family outcomes reports, released on the 6th of January this year, shows that for NDIS participants aged 15 years and older, 62% felt satisfied with their life. That was up from 20%. 78% reported an ability to choose how they spend their spare time, up 34%. For young participants who are starting school, 68% of their parents say their child can now make friends outside of school, a massive improvement. For families and carers, 55% are now able to engage in paid employment. That's a 20% increase in what was the case. 87% of those in a paid job are working 15 hours or more, which is near the Australian population benchmark of 88%. Before the NDIS, being a carer meant you had to make very tough choices between care or income, and we're beginning to break down that binary. 75% of families and carers feel more confident about the future of their family member with a disability under the NDIS. That is an increase of 80% from where it was. So there is evidence that for people on the NDIS, it is working for many of them. And that's something that the shareholders of the scheme, the Australian taxpayers and citizens, should be proud of. And I have to say, of course, what's the alternative if we had no NDIS? We've got a big picture. We've outlined some of the challenges and some of the cost pressures, and we're not shirking at how we can try and moderate the growth curve. But I'm reminded, and I've certainly reminded people of where it came from. We've talked about a plan to fix the problems, how we want to increase trust by not recourse to the legal system as often, by getting people out of hospitals, which incidentally saves the state hospital budgets millions of dollars, literally, on a monthly basis. We're committed to fixing the NDIS, and I actually think on this matter, and some in the opposition have been generous enough to say they think only Labor can fix it to build that trust issue. That is the task in front of us as we approach the 10th anniversary. The growth trajectory needs to moderate. But there'll be no one on the scheme who disagrees with that. But what we need to do is make sure that we don't have a deficit view of the NDIS, and we understand the need to invest, to create and identify value, to rely upon evidence for what we fund and for how we measure things. The scheme needs to be sustainable so it stands ready to serve future generations. And let's be really, really direct. You never know when you're going to need the NDIS. Robert Frost, the great American poet laureate, once described when he was talking about the death of his son at a very young age. We called these the shafts of fate. I've got a cousin, 48, beautiful woman, a mother. She's had a catastrophic heart attack. She's strong and doing everything she can recover. But to realise that your own family are in the hospital ward where you visited 2 months earlier to sort out bed block for the NDIS, none of us are immune from the need. To those who say that we can never afford a scheme like this, think about what life for a person with a disability and their family is like. Ask them what it was like beforehand. We don't want to go back. The NDIS gives something that money alone can't buy, and that, I dare say, is peace of mind for families and hope. It's relief from what I described 15 years ago, the midnight anxiety. The NDIS was formed by advocates and by politicians, for sure, by the bipartisan agreement of both parties. But for me, the inspiration were mothers. And there are plenty of dads who are carers too. But I met so many mothers in that first year or two as parliamentary secretary. It was born of a mother's movement and that midnight anxiety of ageing parents in their 70s and their 80s. Who will care and love for their adult child in the manner in which they've worked so hard their whole life? This scheme can't fulfil that promise of the midnight anxiety yet, but that is my goal. You know, it does mean so many different things to so many people. Perhaps I'm going to conclude, well, not perhaps, I will conclude, just reading a small selection of some of the emails that come into my office to give the very human side of what is going on. This is from a parent of an NDIS participant. I'm very happy to report that we've had a positive outcome from the NDIA. My son has received an updated plan to match his significant needs and ensure he's able to remain in his current home. Most importantly, he won't be forced into residential aged care. Another participant has written to me. I suffered a stroke in 2018. I lost the use of my left arm and my left leg. If not for the NDIS, I would have had to sell the family home. So I want to thank you for the NDIS. This was from a man whose brother was in danger of having to move out of his group home, but was informed a solution had been found. Yesterday was quite an amazing day. Firstly, my brother's reviewed NDIS plan was approved. Secondly, the bank was convinced to keep his NDIS group home operating. Whatever role you played in this win, for the faceless person who has no voice, a sincere thank you to all. You've totally changed the tone of Christmas, from despair and uncertainty to joy and relief. Perhaps this message captures the midnight anxiety I referred to earlier. This mother and father had to appeal the reduction, the very significant reduction in their daughter's support all the way to the AAT. Whilst the road we travelled through those months was a worrying, anxious and stressful time for us as ageing parents in our 70s, we continue to support our daughter as we have for over 47 years. But as all ageing parents, we worry about what happens when we are no longer there to advocate for her. Your words give us hope. The meeting eventuated and all of her supports were reinstated. Now the hardened and the cynical can say, well, they would say that. My response is, they do say that. These emails, the calls, the face-to-face meetings where I hear the stories of relief and of lives being enriched are the reason why Australian taxpayers fund the scheme. They're the reasons why both parties, major parties, supported the scheme. In fact, all parties supported the scheme. But the point about these stories is much more than that. They could be any of us at any time. So I accept that one of the biggest jobs in the Albanese government is to get the NDIS back on track. And it's a task which I relish. At 10 years of the scheme, it's a privilege, which isn't often granted in politics, to come back to something that you were involved in at the start and to help get it right. I think that as a nation, we need to shift our thinking on the NDIS. We hear a lot about the price of the NDIS, fair enough, but we don't hear enough about the value of the NDIS. We need to focus more on the outcomes achieved and then use that to govern the decisions and make sure that we get the right value, the right investment with the right evidence. But I think fundamentally we need a greater appreciation of the challenges that face Australians with disability. The NDIS is an investment, not a deficit. It's a promise, not a broken social contract. It's hope, not misery. It's an acknowledgement that in a country like ours, we are still capable in the 21st century, when people talk about how broken politics is, of accomplishing something which is world-leading and which we can indeed improve upon. Thank you very much for listening tonight.
So many thanks to Minister Shorten for a fine presentation tonight, and with a message plus a lot of detail. Before we come to question and discussion, I just remind you, everyone here, if you're asking a question or making a comment, you've got to speak up, but don't stand up. And now we'll come to questions and discussion. Can we just come back here, Mr. Shorten? As I recall, you, when you spoke for the Sydney Institute early in the Rudd government, you were then the Parliamentary Secretary, and it's nearly 10 years ago now, and it's come a long way to what you're talking about tonight. But can I just go and raise one issue, which is an issue which was mentioned by your colleague, or your present colleague Andrew Charlton, that in between his work on the Rudd government, then he went outside, and now he's back as the Labor member out in Parramatta. He gave a speech where he said that one of the errors was that a deal was done, I think, between the Gillard government and the various states, that really after a certain, I'm not an expert on this, after a certain period of years, put too much responsibility on the Commonwealth, and therefore gave the states a way of getting out of some of their obligations. You touched on this sort of issue tonight. So what's the situation with that? What's the balance? What would be the proper balance between the responsibilities of the Commonwealth government and the responsibilities of the states and territories?
Federation, it's always in the news, isn't it? Well, the proper balance might be not to have states, but if we can't go back and rewrite that, joking-ish. No, in all seriousness, we do have to have a conversation with the states. But the Prime Minister and the First Minister seem to be working quite effectively. Perhaps the hangover of the National Cabinet of COVID is that the Premiers and the Feds can sit down together and start trying to iron out issues. Obviously, the First Ministers have said that they want to talk about healthcare on Friday, and that's a very worthy topic. But I do think the funding relationship between the states and the Feds and disability does need to be addressed. But it's not just that the I think what's happened essentially in the subsequent agreements actually negotiated by the coalition in the states is that there was an indexation provision as the costs increased. It was meant to be 50-50. And the states, they're cunning traders. I'm sure that their natural antecedents were, bartering on the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 19th century, making a living. They're very good traders, the states. They had about a 4% indexation rate, and any increase in costs above that we pick up. That hasn't gone so well for the feds. But anyway, we'll work that through with the states. I've got excellent disability ministers. I know the First Ministers want to see the scheme improved. The thing is, if the NDIS is properly funded, then we're unblocking hospital beds. If the NDIS is able to find accommodation for people, that frees up residential accommodation for aged care. If the NDIS is working well, we're training up people, then that attracts people to work across the whole caring economy, including veterans, healthcare and aged care. So there's the NDIS, to some extent, talk about that, is we're having a speech tonight from about one piece of the puzzle, a big piece of the puzzle, but not the only piece of the puzzle. What we need to recognise is the scheme was never designed for every Australian with a disability. It was designed for the most severely impaired, who needed support with really key functional parts of living. It wasn't for everyone. Part of the challenge is, and it's not just even a state-federal issue, is a local government issue, is if you are a treating health professional and you know that the NDIS is the most likely to provide the funding support for the patient you're seeing, then sometimes diagnosis follows that, doesn't it? That doesn't mean people are unprofessional at all. Absolutely not. I'm just saying that there are facts, and the fact is that the NDIS is a well-funded scheme. So, yes, we need to work with the states and we need to talk about the relationship, but it's not just even the relative payments to NDIS. And the states have, been pretty good on a range of issues. But community mental health is very problematic, how we fund that. I think there's challenge in our education systems for kids with developmental delays. Are the schools adequately giving them the resources? If you're a parent of a child who's got a developmental delay, a learning delay, it's a very isolating experience sometimes dealing with your school. There are schools which are good. But parents often tell me they're made to feel like bullies and complainers. You don't always want your discussion with the school principal to be about how your child's welfare. So I guess I'm saying to you, Gerard, it's all of the above. So yeah, we need to talk to the states, but we also need to recognise that there's a world outside of the NDIS where all of us need to lift, and indeed the private sector. We need to... The dial hasn't really shifted on disability employment in 30 years. And a lot of companies worry that somehow there's a greater impost on HR if you employ a person with disability. And some of the disability employment services are very good and some not so good. So we need to, if we're going to make the NDIS more effective, it's a challenge for everyone and not just within the sheer realm of the levers that I directly control as a minister.
Question down the back.
Thank you, Minister. Your acknowledgement of many of the problems was pretty good in my view. Just a comment, 500,000 plus with a population of only 25 million, that's 2%, over 2%. 150 of all Australians need some help from the NDIS. The figures seem to have blown out incredibly. I had personal knowledge, somebody I know very well, who doesn't qualify it at all, yet they're on the NDIS. As you recognise, which I was pleased to see, the rorting and the over-servicing on the NDIS is appalling.
I get you.
But thank you, and
No,
with respect, Minister, the best of luck, because you've got one hell of a job.
Now, not everyone will have heard that, so the suggestion is, you may want to repeat it, but the suggestion is the percentage of Australians on the NDIS per head of population is very high, and that some people are rorting the system. I think that's the thesis.
That summarised it in a fairly blunt way, in Gerard style. I think there was a lot of unmet need. I'm not sure we realise quite how prevalent disability is in the community. We have nominally 4.5 million people who self-report with a disability, but I've got no doubt. I don't think that or I think that the vast majority of people on the scheme are fair income. So I think you're implying there that some people are getting on the scheme when they're not disabled or not sufficient. I don't share that view. I think I said in my speech, I caution against people when we talk about the scheme cost. I'm not going to blame the person with a disability for being too expensive, because that's not the case. I think that there was a lot of unmet need in this country. A lot of families were doing a whole lot of stuff and really just barely making ends meet. So I don't think we've found a whole new planet of people with disabilities since the NDIS came on and transported them into the scheme. I do think there's rorting. I think there's over-servicing. One of the big challenges we've got is we pay for volume of activity and we're not analysing outcome. That's not the fault of the participant. I also think there hasn't been sufficient scrutiny of the back office of this payment system. I genuinely don't think that. I also think there's been needless litigation. We've uncovered a matter which was fought by the old agency for 2.5 years about a person who's eligible to be on the scheme who needed a special sleep apnea machine. For 2.5 years, the applicant argued with the agency. It's available on Medicare. I'm aware of hospitals, not all hospitals, but a lot of them have transferred a lot of costs onto the NDIS. There's a very rare condition where some children, very few, but are born with only one eye. Hospitals used to, it's a very rare condition, but they would pay for the other eye, cosmetic. All of a sudden that's on the NDIS. I do think there's a wake-up call in the school system. So I'm not starting reform by saying that a child who's been diagnosed with autism level 2 shouldn't be on the scheme. I'm starting from the point of view that I don't think the scheme has been sufficiently managed. It hasn't been managed well enough for the people in the scheme. I did an event with Tanya Plibisek down in Waterloo in the public housing today. 130 people there. Plenty of people on the scheme, people doing it really tough. So this is sort of an interesting contrast here to there today. When I said we've got to do something about some service providers, and by the way, most service providers are doing the right thing. Disability carers work very hard and don't receive very much remuneration. So I'm a bit of a fan of the whole system overall. But when I said we've got to do something about some of the shonks, some of the service providers, getting away with it, the whole room started applauding. So I would invite you to think, as we talk about the scheme, that the taxpayer and the person on the scheme are not antagonistic. They have a lot more in common. But they have a right to better leadership from their government and a more interested and focused approach.
Question here. Got to be brief.
Sure, if you can hear me down the back of the room. But I'm with you all the way on people who are say that I've got friends that have got this problem of what to do with their children when they're gone. But I have heard, and I know cases of young people who have mental health problems. We have Headspace, we have all this stuff. Now there are many of them going on NDIS. And I know 2 young women in Victoria who are only, I don't think either of them have made 20, are on NDIS pensions. And it looks like they're going to spend their life on NDIS pensions when they're not, to my mind, in a situation where they really need that. Has there been any assessment in the mental health area where you can get outcomes rather than a lifetime on a pension?
Well, there's a lot of urban myths about this scheme, and I don't dismiss what people hear anecdotally. But just a couple of sort of numbers. Of the scheme, about 58 to 60,000 have a psychosocial condition as their dominant disability. So that's not actually that many, 60,000. Part of the problem is that when the scheme was created, the states, in order to meet some of their funding obligations, rolled, I think, some of the mental health schemes, community mental health provisions, which help people with episodic illness, and they use that funding. So I don't think there are an epidemic of people with mental health issues getting into the scheme, because the numbers don't reflect that, I'll be honest. But there is a wasteland where people do need periodic assistance, and other than Headspace, I think, especially in my opinion for adults, there are families at wit's end. And when we talk about mental health, you might have been on ice and it's wrecked you. You can go to the hospital if you've got a severe condition, but then where do you go? The NDIS can't cover all those people. The NDIS doesn't pay a pension, by the way. That's the disability support pension, and I guess that's a separate area. No, but the NDIS will pay for some supports. I don't honestly think that people with severe mental illness are a massive cost driver in the scheme. I do think there's a challenge with mental health, and that maybe 250,000 people who used to get some assistance before NDIS, who don't need to be on NDIS, I think they've been, they're adrift, and there's a problem there.
There's a question there, I think.
How long does it go on servicing someone? You know, if a child has a disability, is this...
So the question is, how long does it go on servicing?
Well, it depends what your disability is. I think for some kids, it's not inevitable if you come onto the scheme that you stay on the scheme. That early intervention should be able to help get you ready for schooling, and if the right supports are in school, then that targeted early intervention works really well. But for other disabilities, they're permanent. And again, I know that the numbers surprise some people when you sort of see it bundled up, but the reality is that the impairments are permanent. And so I think disability hasn't been properly measured in this country for since settlement. And I think now the NDIS exists, we're finally examining what actually happens and how people live. So not everyone's on it for life, but I would say to participants that if you've got a permanent impairment and it's having a major effect on your functionality, well, they live with that for their whole life.
Question there?
Yeah, so what's the funding profile? Is it the idea that you're trying to bring the cost back down to the existing proposal? Is it looking to maybe bring in, it's a lot about the super industry coming into social housing? How's the extra cost going to be funded, I suppose, is my question.
Question about the funding profile.
Yeah, I think that a good outcome would be the rate of growth, rather than being that, is lower. I'm not looking to... most people with disabilities not living high on the hog. They're not getting yachts and they're not heading off overseas. I guess you can always find a sensationalist story. That is not the lived experience of 99% of people. But I do think that can existing funds be spent better? Absolutely. The payment system, servicing, the scrutiny, making sure that the investments we make in people are based upon evidence, assisting people to live at home. There's so much, I think there is waste and delay in the system, which if we just mastered that, would have a significant improvement to the bottom line of the scheme. But you mentioned super and going beyond it. We've got a challenge in our housing in Australia. It's not, if you like, NDIS exposes some of the problem. We don't have enough houses. Rental market is incredibly expensive. Whatever, the Reserve Bank's latest, whatever decision, life's tough in terms of accessing housing. So I think the more that and the government's got other policies in terms of attracting more investment into social housing so that we can help release some of that pressure.
I think there's a question there, yeah?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and congratulate you on the legacy that you have brought in as the initiator of this.
Okay, there's a congratulation on the legacy you brought in.
We didn't have to totally interrupt that. Okay.
No, but we've got to hear.
No, I know.
As a investor on behalf of our clients in special disability housing and an investment manager for a disability group and a service provider, one of the comments that are coming back to us a little bit from those providers is that the vacancy rate that's occurring in housing despite the demand. Is that something you're...
Yeah, that's a real problem. Yes. What the gentleman's describing is that the scheme has now attracted investors, like Macquarie Bank now invests in disability housing. I know that causes angst in some quarters. People say there's no role for the private sector. I don't share that view. One of I'll get to your specific answer, but the lesson I learned 15 years ago is that the problem with disability isn't the disability, it's having a lack of money and a lack of power. By the way, that is a general problem in life, but it is a case of certainly for people with disability. So the aim of the NDIS was to create a social insurance fund which would draw resources to it. interest people to come and work in these careers. Give family members who've got a skill at caring for their own to become professional carers in terms of a sector and employment. There's now 300,000 people in Australia who would say they work in disability work. It's massive. And that's all because there is some coherent investment. So housing and special disability accommodation, to me, it is incomprehensible that we have vacancy rates when housing is scarce. Part of that's due to slow decision making. Part of that's due towards, just because a person has a disability doesn't mean they automatically want to live with the next person with a disability. You've got to find the right people. So I think that the marketplace for information is quite imperfect at the moment in housing and people looking for long-term disability accommodation. You find builders who say we can't find anyone. You find providers who say we can't find any houses. You find people with disabilities say, I'll live with that person or that person. You find people with disability want to live with their wife or their husband and not with a couple of strangers. But one thing's for sure, the information doesn't move as concurrently as it should. What we've seen in the hospital discharge system is literally, it's like if you had to catch a railway train, 5 stations. Normally, the savvy commuter gets on the train and the train goes to the 5th station for the other intervening 4. That's not how NDIA works. We have a decision-making process where if a person's in hospital, 1, you get the train station, they're in hospital, are they eligible for NDIS? And then you've got to wait for a decision. You get off at the 1st station. Then you get on till the next train comes by and you work out, can they have a house or what sort of housing? So then you get off at that decision, you wait for that. Then you work out what assistive technology they need, and that's you get on and off at the next station. Nothing in the NDIA, and I know it's not as simple as this, but this is how I felt as a new minister. Everything seemed to be done consecutively, not concurrently. The other thing is that we'd have people in the system who can make decisions. Some of the allied health clinicians at the rehab hospitals are amazing. They're just amazing. But we'd have a decision where they'd recommend an electric wheelchair for $40,000. They're expensive. They're going to last you any number of years. They're your wheels, your legs. But the headrest would be $2,000 and it was bespoke. So the agency would argue about the cost of the headrest. We had a situation we resolved in Perth the other day where they put into the roof the mechanical device for a hoist, but then we were arguing about the hoist. So we're getting on top of that stuff.
So we're getting close to the end. Okay, so you spoke here as a parliamentary secretary in your very early days in Parliament about what became the NDIS. You're here now on about 10 years anniversary. If you came back in 5 or 10 years, what would you hope to tell us then?
I'm always reminded of a story that a friend of mine who was an Australian Maltese trade unionist, and he worked in the Ironworkers Union out here. But the minister from Malta came out and said, listen, the Valletta dockyard is not, they're not doing any work there. So he asked my union mate, this is in the 1970s, how do I fix up the dockyard? He said, you make this change, you sack this person, you do that. And they said, but they'll kill me. He said, then you get a helicopter to Italy. So we'll see if the reforms that we want to make work, and then I'll decide if I come back. No, in all seriousness, what I would like to see is individuals come up to you if you're on a plane or a train or you're walking in the street and they say, hey, my brother who's 42, he's had Down syndrome his whole life, he's now doing some work, got some paid work, he's got a home office. I'd like a flight attendant who comes up to me on the plane and says, my sister's 33, she's got spina bifida, she's finally been accepted into the scheme. In fact, I'm now going to leave the airline industry and I'm going to set up a business which helps people with disability travel. That's what I'd like to hear, those accomplishments. I'd like to perhaps get some emails from parents in their 70s and 80s and say, it's good. I think that my son and daughter will be okay. Now, what's nice is we're already getting some of that now. The flight attendant's real. The man with whose brother has Down syndrome is 42. That happened to me yesterday. But we've got to make that a universal experience. And I would like to curb the cost curve, the growth curve of the scheme too, so that let's face it, there's so much that we could do if we put our mind to it. I'd like to see more disabled people in Parliament. I'd like to see the NDIS minister be a person with a disability. I'd like to see a person with a disability doing a range of portfolios in our Parliament. I'd like him to be Labor, but other than that, you can't have everything. But it'd be good. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to the Minister. As I said, Mr. Shorten spoke here about 10 years ago, and 10 years later it's been an enormous change. Most of us, and perhaps all of us, know someone with a family or a friend's family who has a disability individual within the family. And what we heard tonight was, I thought, a very empathetic but also tough-minded analysis of the scheme and how it's progressed so far and how it might go in the future. So I thought it was a terrific presentation tonight. I learned a lot. Well done. Hope you have you back sometime.
Sure.
Okay.